Hello and welcome back again, everybody. As you can see, the car is back up in the air, which means we're going back underneath it. So let's take a look at what we're going to be doing in this episode. So we're going to be getting back underneath the car to finish up running the hard lines for both the fuel feed as well as the return. You can see the spool just sitting on the ground right there. So we'll get all those lines taken out. We'll get the Dash 8 hard lines ready to be plumbed to the fuel tank so we can go ahead and install the new fuel pumps. We also have to get underneath in front and reconnect that new power steering line that goes from the rack over here to the reservoir. So I've already went ahead and made the line. This fitting here is from Chase Bays. It's the proper length and has the O-ring that seats down inside of your rack. And then I just did a 90 off to the Dash 8. So we'll bring that low pressure return line back over here to the reservoir, and that setup will be done. Then we're gonna have to go back a little bit where the trans is and go ahead and reconnect the drive shaft. Now once we finish up installing the Dash 8 hard lines, we can go ahead and get these twin Walbro 525 pumps installed into our fuel tank. Now this is on an OST dyno bracket. This allows for twin intake pumps using your stock hanger and your stock top hat. We're gonna modify the top hat a little bit just so we could run those Dash 8 fittings and lines, but otherwise everything else is gonna be stock. And then we'll go ahead and sort out the relays and the electrical connections, so that way once the ECU and everything else is back together, we can go ahead and prime the tank, make sure everything works. For the fuel lines, I have most of the brackets already disconnected, but I have to get up here behind the rear diff and finish up a couple of these little brackets that are holding the hard lines together. And then we can go ahead and drop all that down from the fuel tank. You can see that kind of wraps around under there, kind of goes up and over by the ATTESA pump, and then runs right there. So we'll bring that new Dash 8 hard line up to this location, and then I'll go ahead and run the braided line up to the tank following that path right there. So we'll go ahead and get these last lines disconnected and then get that Dash 8 hardline installed. Stock lines are all out. Now we can go ahead and get this Dash 8 line tied into more of the mounting points along the frame rail, and then we'll go ahead and measure this length, cut it, get it tucked up back behind the rear diff so we can go ahead and route it to the fuel tank, and then we'll go ahead and start routing the return line along next to it. So the feed line is almost done. I went ahead and cut it right before the rear sway bar. So the last mount is going to be at this bracket here, and then the free end will be right behind our suspension. And then we'll have the fittings going to the braided line running up over the rear diff into the fuel tank. So I'll go ahead and get the tube adapter fitting put on this side. I'll take a file and go ahead and clean up any of these little sharp edges there real quick, and then that one will be done. We can start running the return line right next to it. Lines are all in and bolted up to the frame rail. We just have one last spot to tie in up front. We're going to go ahead and put on this Vibrant Dash 8 hardline adapter and get that mounted up, and then we'll make the braided line that goes to the fuel pressure regulator side of the rail. So fuel lines are all done. So again, we already did the fuel feed before. So this time we finished up the fuel return coming out of the fuel pressure regulator. So you can see the fitting sandwiched between the master cylinder for the clutch right there. So the hose runs straight down. Get back under the car. And that line is running straight down here to this dash 8 fitting, which goes to our hard lines. And here you can see the hard lines running parallel to each other all the way down the frame rail to the back. So we'll go ahead and connect the braided line a little bit later when we're actually installing the pumps. But for now, while we're up front, let's go ahead and replace this low pressure return line from the rack going to that reservoir. The hard lines under the car are all buttoned up. Let's go ahead and start working on installing the new fuel pumps. So these are twin Walbro 525 pumps on an OST dyno bracket. This allows you to run twin intake pumps without running a crazy custom expensive fuel hat system for twin intake pumps. So you can see that they're both wide together to a 1/2 inch fitting. So we'll go ahead and connect a piece of this 1/2 inch high pressure fuel line to the bulkhead fitting that will fit on the fuel cap. See, this has a 90-degree out, so there'll be another push lock fitting on this side, which will feed down under the car to the hard lines that we just installed. So we'll get these installed and wired up. We've got the filters for the pumps themselves. Again, the 1/2 inch line with our bulkhead fitting, some hose clamps, new gasket for the fuel hat itself. We'll go ahead and reinstall that. And then we have individual wiring and relay kits for each pump. So we'll go ahead and wire those in as well. So I got the trunk open. We're going to go ahead and start working on removing this access panel so we could get down to the fuel tank. Alright, so this is the access panel. You could see the wiring coming in from the chassis. Looks like it's already been serviced at one point because they've already torn the tape that holds it down. So who knows what we're going to find inside. Maybe it was just routine maintenance. Maybe there's something different in the pump, so we'll find out. So we'll go ahead and lift off this wire. If this is still covered, you're going to want to peel that up, or I guess tear it out if you have to. But now we're going to remove these 4 10mm bolts. Alright, so now we can see our electrical connection. So the connector over here on the right that's more populated, this is for our fuel float sender, or sensor and the sending unit. And then over here on the left-hand side, this is the power that's going to our fuel pumps. We're going to go ahead and tap into this lead when it comes to wiring in the relays. This is going to tell the pumps to come on. And here we can see our OEM fuel lines. You can see the little arrows on top telling you which direction it's going. So here's our stock feed. Here's our stock return. This is all going to be completely changed. We're going to make our own fittings up on top and then wire this guy in separately. So first we're going to do is go ahead and pop off both of these lines. We'll disconnect our electrical connections, and then we'll go ahead and remove this little ring here so we can get down to our fuel hat. Alright, so it does look like there is some new hose attached to this, but they didn't really give me a whole lot of room to pull the top hat, or the fuel hat, out of the way. So you can see the pump sitting down there in the cradle. So we'll go ahead and reach our hand down there. There's a tab that you have to press down in order to release it. And I'll try and fish my hand down in there. They really didn't, again, leave me a lot of room to get this sucker out of the way. So we'll go ahead and pull that guy out. So now that we have the pump out, I'll show you how it actually clips into place. So if you look at the cradle itself, I guess it would be on the front side, closer to the front of the car, but only located on that side. You can see this little tab. So you have to push that up in order for the cradle to slide out of the slot. Now actually going into the cradle, if you look at the back of the pump, you have this tab back here. You have to push that down in order for this to slide out. So sort of a two-part procedure. Unless you could get your hand back to that little tab originally, you're gonna have to go ahead and release the pump. Then you'll have some room, fish your hand back around, depress that tab, and it'll go ahead and slide out towards the passenger side of the car. All right, so we'll go ahead and get all these lines disconnected from the fuel hat, and we will start getting our new pumps all set up. So now we're going to look at where we have to modify the top hat to fit the Dash 8 bulkheads. So now these little nylon type washers, go ahead and trim down just so it fits in that slot. They really have no sealing properties, so it doesn't really matter even if they're there. It just kind of adds a buffer between the actual fitting and the material of the fuel hat itself. So we'll go ahead and trim back these hard lines, but actually you'll be coming out the opposite way. You'll have two fittings on either side, one for the feed and one for the return. So we'll go ahead and start hacking all this up and make room for our new fittings. Now that we've gone ahead and cleaned out those features, you can see that we have a nice, pretty smooth surface to work with. So everything should sit pretty flush. So we can see where our first fitting is going to line up. And we should have enough room on this side where the flats go ahead and be opposing to each other. And there you go. So there's going to be our feed and our return. So we'll flip it over, we'll cut off the little nubs for the existing lines, so that way nothing's going to interfere with our fittings, and we'll drill some holes. So now that we have the holes drilled, we're going to have to trim our stock fittings back just a little bit so that this guy will sit flush. You can see how it's kind of fouling out that nut there. So we'll go ahead and cut all this back, probably about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4 of an inch or so. And that should allow this fitting just to sit nice and square in there. While we're waiting for all the sealant on the fuel hat to dry, let's go ahead and start working on our wiring for the relays going to our fuel pumps. So looking at the MSD wiring kit, you get the relay itself, you get a circuit breaker for the battery, the positive feed, and then they give you a bag of terminals. So if we look at the relay itself, we got 4 wires coming off. You can look at the different gauge wire gauges there. So the red wire is going to be our positive. So this is going to be coming from our battery, coming from our circuit breaker. The blue wire, you can notice that that's very similar gauge. This is going to be going down to the fuel pump. So this is going to be the power feed to the fuel pumps. Each relay is going to power 1 pump. The yellow wire is our signal wire coming from our stock loom to tell the pumps to turn on. And the gray wire is going to be our chassis ground. Now you want to keep these relatively close and kind of looking around at where I want to mount them. I've seen some people mount them over here by the ATTESA reservoir, but being that I run the stock interior and I didn't want to make this too bulky over here, I have free space down where the spare tire goes. So what I'm going to do is make an angle bracket that's going to come off one of these bolt locations. I'll use a longer bolt when we screw this back on. And I'll make the bracket sit down here. So both relays will be sitting close to the tank, but down here in this free space. So that way the wiring will be minimal at best. We'll have some extra wire to run down to the pump so we're not stretching anything too tight. So let's go ahead and start making that bracket. We'll get our relays mounted where we want it, and then we'll start running our wires. So that's basically what's going to be, right? A little angle bracket coming off where this top cover sits. And then these will sit down here underneath the floor mat. And then we'll go ahead and undo these bundles, group our like wires together, and let's start terminating. So the first wires that we're going to work with are going to be the gray wires. Now these are going to be our ground wires, and we're going to run them over here to the chassis where the reservoir mounts up. So I'm just going to go ahead and group these wires together. We're going to kind of figure out the route that these guys are going to take. It's basically going to be just a straight shot. Give ourselves a little bit of stress relief there so we're not too tight. That should be a good amount of excess wire. I'll go ahead and make a cut mark on both of these. The next wire we're going to work with is the signal wire to turn the relays on. So if we look at the two plugs again from the top hat, we have our 3-wire and our 2-wire. The 3-wire is for the float sensor, but this one's going to be for our power. So if we look at this black with the yellow stripe, we're going to go ahead and tap into this guy. But I'm going to do it over here, so that way we're not running more wire down through the grommet. We'll go ahead and just attach it to this main bundle here, so we could just still pull the cover panel away, and the only wire that's going to go down through there is going to be our power and our ground for the pumps themselves. So we'll go ahead and peel back some of this shielding. We'll find our black and yellow wire in here. We'll go ahead and tap into that guy. So this is heat shrinkable, so because the gas tank is open, I'm not going to bring over a heat gun right now. So I'll go ahead and shrink that down and tie these in together. So now both of these are receiving the signal from our stock loom to turn the pump on. So next we're going to be working with our blue wire. This is the power that's going to be going down to the pumps. I'm only going to make it about yay long, and we're going to put on some connects or quick disconnects here, so that way we could run this wire down through the access panel and down into the fuel tank. So these will be relatively short with little quick disconnects on them. All right, again, these are all heat shrinkable, so I'll go ahead and shrink those down once the tank is getting back together, so we're not exposing any heat while that sucker is open. So once the pumps get down and inside, we'll go ahead and run these lines down along with the grounds. So we'll leave these as is for now, and let's work on the power. So now with the power lines, we could just run these guys up along the back side of the trunk. There's a harness that runs behind this panel that I could go ahead and tie it into, so it's up and out of the way. All the wires will stay nice and clean. These will all be grouped together and going off to the pump. So now we just have to mount the breaker so we know how long these lines have to be. So if you look at the battery box, I already have my main breaker mounted on top, and what I think I'm going to do just for the time being, because I'm not running some crazy trunk setup right now, is I'm just going to mount these guys on top here. It's non-conductive. It'll keep the wire distance short coming out of the battery, or I can pop this off, and that way we could go ahead and run the power wire up along the back side and then up to our terminals here. So I'll go ahead and mount these guys to the top, and we'll keep going. we kind of see how this is going to sit. Obviously the top isn't on the battery box, but these are going to be sitting side by side. Here's the main breaker. So now we can go ahead and start running our wires and get our distance to each one of our breaker terminals, and then we'll make our power wire going from the positive terminal to each one of the breakers as well. Went ahead and tidied up the wiring, but that's basically it. So nice short runs going to our signal wire. Again, the blue wires is going to be the power going down and into the tank for the pumps. We have our grounds over here, and then our power comes underneath. It's tied to the bundle under there to the circuit breakers. So with the relay wiring already sorted out, we're going to start working on the ground wires that's going to connect from the chassis. And then again, it's just going to be a free lead to a quick disconnect right here because we're going to have the other hard wire to the pump coming out of the tank and the fuel hat. So we're going to ahead use this extra gray wire that came off of our relay, and we'll make a couple ground leads to plug into our fuel pumps. here's our 2 power wires for a pump and our 2 ground wires for a pump. So now we can go ahead and attach the other side of the free leads of our gray wire to the wiring that comes off the pump itself, because that's going to be coming out of the fuel hat. And then we'll go ahead and plug on the other side of the quick disconnect. So now we're going to focus on the leads coming off of the wiring for the fuel pumps themselves. We're going to take the spare wire that we used inside the car, and we're going to go ahead and connect our power and our ground. We're going to leave one end just free because that's going to come up through the fuel hat. We'll go ahead and put that quick disconnect to plug into the wiring that we just did back in the car. So we'll go ahead and use these butt splices. They are the weatherproof, so we'll go ahead and hit it with some heat so it shrinks down and seals it on the wire insulation. Next little wiring connection that we have to make is actually removing this plug from the stock fuel pump assembly, and this basically feeds the ground. So there's also this little plug that was spliced into the ground wire, which goes to our fuel float sensor and sending unit. So we're going to go ahead and splice that back together so it still has the stock connection to the original harness, and then we could go ahead and still facilitate the ground connection for our float sensor. There's the completed assembly. So the OEM connection coming in through the fuel hat. Here's the splice we just made and the wire going to the float sensor. So I've obviously de-pinned the power wire because we're not going to be using that anymore. So we're actually going to drill a small hole right where this little Nissan badge is. And it comes out right in this feature right there. So that's where we're going to run all of our wiring that we've made for our pumps. Now it's time to go ahead and install our fuel pumps. So again, on the OST dyno bracket, I went ahead and installed the filters onto the pumps. Now the bracket itself sits about 1/4 inch off the bottom of the tank, so you want to make sure that these filters are spaced down a little bit to fill that 1/4 inch gap. So we're going to go ahead and get this down and in place. We can figure out how much of this 1/2 inch line we need to cut for the fuel hat. You can see I kind of cleaned up some of the wiring. I found some smaller zip ties that better fit the diameter of the bundle. So again, here's our power and our ground for both the pumps. We'll go ahead and lift off the cover, get the bracket down and in place, and we'll go ahead and measure how much line we need. So the OST bracket is significantly longer than the stock unit. So you can see how it kind of took a little bit of time to get it nestled inside the cradle. Now that back feature, it's kind of hard to see. Bottom right-hand side, kind of in the middle, is like a tab that's sticking straight up. So that's about as far back as you're going to be able to get that bracket into there, because it's not going to pop over that locking tab. So now we'll go ahead and figure out the length that we need for this 1/2-inch line. Go ahead and get this cut. So I want this to be long enough to where it's going to allow me to lift up the fuel hat and be able to disconnect it, but not too long to where when I put it back in the tank it gets all bunched up and it's going to foul up our sending unit. So we'll go ahead and make that cut there and start assembling our fuel hat. Before we go ahead and reinstall the fuel hat, we're going to need to secure that OST dyno bracket in place. So it gives you this top part which goes over the back of the bracket. This sits on top. We'll go ahead and just fasten these two provided nuts down onto the bracket, which will kind of sandwich it and hold it in place. Before we get the fuel hat down in place, we're going to go ahead and get the new gasket situated, so we can go ahead and fish the hose and the new wiring through that, and then feed all this up through the fuel hat. Ran all the wires back through the grommet, plugged in our original electrical connections, so now we're ready to go ahead and finish these up, add on the quick disconnects, and go ahead and plug in our power and our ground, and shrink these connections. And here's the completed assembly. So again, probably going to clean up that cover or just make a new one. But just to go back over our wiring, so we have the relay for each pump down here. Here's our 12-volt power coming in from the battery and our breakers. This yellow line is a signal line from our ECU, so that's getting tied into our relay as well. The blue line is the power going down to our pumps, and then the gray lines from both branches are for our chassis grounds. So we'll go ahead and start working on getting the hoses made up and sent down behind the fuel tank, and then these guys will be done. Alright, so now that we have everything reinstalled, you can see the path that our lines are kind of sitting on. So I'm kind of going over what it is that I want to do, whether I want to drill or kind of cut out a circular feature here for the lines to go down behind the tank, or just cut out a channel so that way you're not putting as much stress on the hoses and they could just kind of curve down underneath. And I'm definitely going to make a custom cover for this. Probably use the base, but make a little cowl and have it extend down to cover any opening that I cut out. So I guess we're going to have to cut up the trunk here a bit. Now, even though we've already sealed up the fuel tank as far as the fuel hat's concerned, we still have exposed line that's not plugged in yet. So there's still a chance of vapors. And if we start cutting this and it sparks, I don't want to blow myself, my car, and my house up. So we're going to go ahead and remove the cover plate, undo the connections. We're going to drop down the fuel tank so that way there's no chance we'll wheel it outside. And then we could go ahead and cut out that little channel for the lines to go down. But before we do that, I think I'm going to swap out these straight fittings for a 45. Because if I cut out to where this little hump is, the angle of this fitting will direct it right down the back side of the tank. And it'll be a little bit easier as far as routing the lines, not putting too much pressure or kinking them, trying to curve it down underneath. So once these are off, I'll go ahead and swap these guys out as well. But let's go ahead and start taking this off, then we'll move under the car and drop the tank. So we're going to start off under the car, under the fuel tank. If you look along the edge of the bumper, you'll see where the straps connect right behind the bumper support. Now, just given the layout of these straps, it's a little bit easier to disconnect the passenger side bolt from that one. But as you can see, that bolt is pretty well hidden by the strap itself. So if we go to the back of the tank under the car, this side, you can see it has a clear bolt with clear access. And then that one's kind of tucked up behind the diff, so a little bit harder to get to. So we'll do one on either side in order to remove this strap. Now, if you still have your stock heat shield for your exhaust, you're going to want to remove those two nuts as well, so that way it'll release the strap. And that's about it. Otherwise, as far as the filler neck, you can see that goes up to where your gas cap is. All we have to do is just push that out with our hand once it starts to lower, and it'll come right out. Now, as far as these lines, everything's disconnected for the feed and the return, but as far as the evap line, that guy right there, it's still going to the one-way check valve, which is back up in there somewhere. So once we lower it down, we'll go ahead and disconnect it from this side of the tank, and the tank will be free. We'll wheel it outside, and we'll start cutting a giant hole, or not that giant, but as small as we can get away with, in the trunk floor. And then once you gain access to this point, you can go ahead and disconnect that little ground strap behind the filler neck. Now you might be able to get it from going up and underneath through the wheel well, or fish your hand in there and get that thing loose. So I went ahead and removed the rear wheel from the driver's side so we get a better view of that little ground strap there. So a little 10mm bolt holding that sucker on. We'll go ahead and pop that off, and the gas tank should be free to drop out. Now we just have to disconnect this evap line going from our fuel tank, and she'll be free. So now that the tank is safely outside, don't have to worry about any vapors and blowing myself up. Let's start cutting up the tank here. Or the trunk. So the two lines are sitting about right here, right? So I need to cut out basically this section for that 45-degree angle to dip down right where this curve is, because that's basically where the tank starts to slant down. So the fitting should follow the curvature of the tank, and we're just gonna notch out that section there, and I'll probably end up making a whole complete custom cover just to make everything look nice again. And here's the completed harness. So went ahead and removed all those temporary spot ties on the wires now that we saw where all the wires were being ran to, and went ahead and added this pre-woven split over braid over the existing harness. Give it a couple twists to prevent it from coming open, and then obviously add some spot ties. So this will provide some good abrasion protection, and then we're going to be putting that stock carpet back on top of everything and making a new covering cowl for that part. So that's checked off the list. All right, it is fluid time. So we're gonna go ahead and fill up the transfer case, and the front diff. Now, unless the transmission, the engine's out of the car, you're gonna wanna go ahead and pick up a couple of these little pumps. The front diff, you could get away with a long enough hose and a funnel, but these guys are worth the couple bucks. So for the transmission, I'm gonna be running the heavyweight shockproof. I was running the lightweight, but now with more power, and it's still the stock trans, so I'm gonna run the heavyweight. For the transfer case, we need automatic D fluid, the Nissan brand. So it's 1.9 quarts, so just shy of 2. For the transmission, it's like 4 1/3 quart. And then for the front diff, we need a 85W90, and that's going to be 1 quart. So we're going to crawl back under the car. I'll show you where the fluid goes, but I'm going to save you guys the hassle of watching me sit there and just pump a bunch of fluid back into the thing. So we'll crawl back under, and then I'll see you afterwards. If we take a look at the front diff, this bottom port is your drain and the top one is your fill. Now I know that this was already cleaned when we had the engine built, so I know that this is empty. I'm letting the transmission drain a little bit right now because after that was moved around, we had a little bit settle down to the bottom, so just letting the last of that lightweight shockproof drain out before we put the heavyweight in. So I know this is empty, so we'll go ahead and undo this top port here with a 1/2-inch drive, and then we'll go ahead and fill it up. Moving on to the transmission, went ahead and plugged it up. It's already drained out everything that was left in the case. So now we'll go ahead and unscrew this top port here up on the side of the transmission, right across from the prop shaft that connects your transfer case to your front diff. So again, a 1/2-inch drive, we'll go ahead and loosen that guy up, and then we'll start filling it. And lastly, we just have the transfer case. So I went ahead and drained it. The drain bolt or port here, plug is on the side, closest to the driver's side. So I went ahead and drained out any excess fluid. And if you look on the back side, up kind of like the 11 o'clock, you're gonna see the fill plug. So they kind of switch it up on you. The drain is a half, the fill is a 3/8. So again, we're going to go ahead and remove that plug, and then we'll put in some new fluid. Okay, so the fuel system is done. All the hard lines underneath the car are complete. The lines going from the tank are all done. Everything's all sealed up, so there's no more fumes or anything like that, which means we are one step closer to turning that key to the on position. We're not starting it just yet, but at least to the on position to make sure that there aren't any fuel leaks, right? The pumps are gonna cycle. But there's one thing that we have to do before we get to that step, and that's with the ATTESA system. Now, because I dropped the line when I pulled the trans, it drained out all the fluid. And when I turn the ignition to the on position, I don't want that pump to start pumping air. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and fill up the reservoir. We're gonna bleed the pump, and that way when we go to turn the ignition on and we go ahead and pull the connector which cycles the pump, we could start bleeding the fluid from the transmission side, and we don't have to worry about the pump itself pushing a bunch of air. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and work in the trunk and then crawl back under the car, get the ATTESA system all buttoned up at the same time, making sure that there aren't any fuel leaks. Now I went ahead and I finished all the connections on the ECU. All the wires and connections are still on the floor of the passenger side. I still have to clean it up and tuck it away, but at least this way the ECU is plugged in. We could power that guy on for the first time, download the built-in map that's used for the initial startup, and a good base for tuning, or it's not really meant to be driven on, but it's a good startup base. So we can go ahead and get that ready, get that connected. I already updated my laptop with the latest version of PC-Link, so that's ready to go. So yeah, the end of this video is going to be a little bit exciting. We're going to turn power back on in the car for the first time since, well, it was parked. First things first, we're going to work with the reservoir. We're going to fill this back up to the max line, then actually a little bit past that, in order to get it ready to start bleeding the system. I'm going to be using a Nissan brand ATF, just like we did in the transfer case. So you could use a funnel if you want, or you should be able to fit the quart in there. But we're going to go ahead and fill this up to the max line. Then we're actually going to go 30 millimeters above that. If you live in the US, it's about 1.1 inches above our max fill line. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up, and then we'll measure the height, and then we'll crawl underneath the car and start bleeding the pump. All right, so we're at that mark, that 30 millimeter, about 1.1 inch above our max line. Now you could also see this big air gap between our lower fluid and our upper fluid. So this is going to come into play later when we go ahead and start bleeding the actual system itself. But for now, we could go ahead and cap this off. We'll crawl down underneath the car. We'll start bleeding the actual pump itself, and then we'll get ready to bleed the system. All right, so you can see the fluid starting to fill the line here, but this is some of the old fluid still that was still trapped in the system. So we'll go ahead and wait until we start seeing that color change to that darker red of the Nissan ATF. We'll cap her off. So now we see all the fluid starting to change color to that Nissan ATF, that reddish color. So we'll go ahead and close off this bleed valve up here, and then we'll top off our reservoir and work on getting our ignition to the on position so we could start purging the rest of the system. You can see just how much fluid we purged just by bleeding the pump itself. So we'll go ahead and fill it back up above the max line, and then we'll If you take a look behind the driver's side kick panel, you're going to see this little white connector. It's a yellow wire with a green stripe, and this is basically for our ATTESA system. So once we go ahead and switch the key to the on position, we're going to disconnect this plug, and this is going to turn it into air bleeder mode, and then we crawl underneath to the transmission side and start bleeding the pump. Now remember that gap at the bottom of our reservoir? Well, that's going to come into play a little bit later. Once we bleed out all the air in the line, we're going to come back to this connector. We're going to plug it in, unplug it, plug it in, unplug it, plug it in, unplug it. Do that over and over and over again until we get that air gap at the bottom of the reservoir to about 5 millimeters max, or about 0.2 or 2/10 of an inch. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the driver's seat. We'll get ready to turn on the ignition, and then we'll unplug that guy. All right, so back in the car, got the laptop all hooked up, ready for when the car turns on, so we can go ahead and connect that to the ECU. All right, here we go. Here goes nothing. So a couple of things are going to happen when we go ahead and turn this key. One, we're going to hear the pump start to cycle, and then also the ATTESA system as well. So we'll jump out, make sure there's no leaks, and then we'll climb underneath to the transmission. All right, so after that initial cycle, I don't see or hear any fuel or any fluids really leaking anywhere, which is a great sign. So we'll just kind of double check all the fuel lines. I don't see anything. All right, so now let's crawl underneath the car and we will bleed the ATTESA from the back of the trans. So right at the back of the tail shaft is going to be that nipple. You can see I have the little clear line connected to it again. So we'll go ahead and just crack open that valve. We're only going to do it in like 1 second intervals. You're going to hear the pump kick on as it's cycling through. And we're just going to keep doing that until we see no more air coming out and it's just solid fluid. All right, so we can see we have a nice solid flow of fluid there. So the pump's already stopped. I've already went ahead and closed that nipple there. So we'll go ahead and remove this tube and move back to the reservoir. Now we're gonna have to reconnect and disconnect this plug over and over again in order to get that air gap in the reservoir down to that 5 millimeter max. And if we look down here at that air gap that we saw before, it is much larger. Now we can see that it's well within that 5 millimeter max requirement. Looks like we're well under 0.2, so we're underneath that 5 millimeters. So the ATTESA system is full, flushed, and bled. All right, guys, so back in the car, ECU's connected. The laptop and PC link is talking to it. Got a couple faults that I got to take care of. I'm pretty sure I already know what they are. Yeah, looking good so far. Well, guys, I think that's going to be a pretty good stopping point for this video. As you can see, we just did a test with the ECU. It's communicating with the laptop. We have power back on in the car. All the fluids underneath the car are filled. The fuel lines are all buttoned up. There's no leaks, thank God. So, I mean, we're getting one step closer. So now it's off to my buddy's shop. We're going to fab up a downpipe, some intercooler pipes, maybe a couple other little surprises. Also make that new cover for the fuel tank so we can cover the fuel lines, put the OEM interior back in there, look nice and clean, and then get ready to start it. Do the initial startup, do the first oil change, and send off to the tuner and see what she does. So as always, I appreciate everyone's support. Love talking to you guys online. Be sure to look out for the next one. It may be a little bit, so don't hate me, but appreciate the support, guys. Have a good one.